Salam Sathiyon. Today we are joined by Professor Vijay Prashad, who is the director of the Tricontinental Institute of Research and Development. He's written many notable books, including Washington Bullets, Red Star Over the Third World, many other books that when I was into that really sort of helped me understand imperialism and the structures of power that keep us in the situation that we are today. This is our seventh session for the third annual summer course that we organize every year. So we're very glad that Vijay has uh, come on again. Last year we also had the privilege of having him. So first, just getting straight into it, the first question I would ask is, how exactly do Marxists define colonial capitalism, and how did it develop in British India? Because in Europe and in the West, you have a very clear class struggle, and as a result, revolutions. You have the French Revolution and such, and you see, and it's considered to be historically progressive how capitalism grew and came about. In our region specifically, that did not happen. We inherited capitalism from our colonizers. So, if you could, colonialism to be developed in British India, in the subcontinent region, and how it has evolved since the 1800s till now.
Yeah, first, it's nice to be back with you. It really is. The helper, you are the helper. You're lucky to have a name like that. My name means victory, which is fleeting, doesn't happen much. Yeah. Well, look, the first thing is that capitalism by itself is neither progressive nor regressive. It's what it is. Yeah, it's a name we give to a structure, to a system that exists now globally, which is premised on private property, on some people owning the ability to reproduce the world, to build goods and services. And in doing so, they compete with each other. This small group of people that own goods and services, that own property, they are able to produce goods and services. They compete with each other for the production of these goods and services. That competition is the motor that drives them forward to create better goods and services, that try to wipe each other out, to become more productive. And it's as a consequence of that the goods and services produced in the world increase. And at the same time, inequality increases because the gains from this go to those who control private property. So capitalism by itself is not a moral, there's no moral statement one could make about it. By itself, it's this. It's almost in a strange way inanimate. It doesn't have emotions. It is interested in the creation of profit, in a sense, right? That's what a capitalist is interested in. Well, it's not hard to imagine that had there been no such thing as colonialism, two things would have been difficult. One is that those vast stores of wealth, which become the private property of certain people and then are put to work to build factories and to build this enormous global structure, that huge store of wealth would not have been so easily available. In other words, England, Holland, France, and so on required not only colonialism, but also the enslavement of humans from Africa into plantations in the Americas and so on. All of that produced an obscene amount of wealth in a very short period of time, which became the capital for the development of capitalism. So without colonies, you wouldn't have had that enormous fund of capital. The second thing that you might not have had there not been colonialism is you might not have had one world system under the law of capitalism. You might have had very much competing systems in place. We don't know because We don't know what would have developed, say, in South Asia or in East Asia had colonialism not imposed itself on these parts of the world. Some scholars have said, well, there was a kind of pre-capitalism in South Asia. I don't know. We can't tell where it would have gone. We might have had a world system that was filled with complexities, not with one dominant mode of production in place, because there might have been competing forms of world power. We don't know. But we do know that what happened was that colonialism imposed itself on parts of the world, and your specific question was about South Asia, imposed itself on South Asia, dragged South Asia into the capitalist mode of production, but at a different level, not as a place where capital could be formed. In fact, wealth was drained from South Asia to England, the large capital fund I was talking about. And so South Asia was drained of its wealth. You didn't need a Marxist to tell you that. A liberal intellectual of the 19th century, Dadabhai Nauroji, wrote about this. The basically un-British rule of India is what he called it, the drain of the wealth. That's one facet of capitalism in South Asia. But the other facet is that there was no room, as a consequence of the drain of wealth, for a native bourgeoisie to be created. Bourgeoisies take hundreds of years to develop as a class, with a certain class culture and so on. That was not developed in Southern Asia. You had instead colonial imposition of a state, and you had the creation of a section of the population that became functionaries of the colonial state, but they were not a bourgeoisie. So by the time the British are forced out of South Asia and there's the partition of the subcontinent, you have a part of the world which is integrated into capitalism, but has had its wealth drained away, has very low levels of electrification, industrialization, and so on, and doesn't have a bourgeoisie in a proper sense of the word. There are some sections of industrialists and merchant capitalists and so on. There are various regional, people who own mines and different businesses, but they are not really a bourgeoisie in the cultural and political sense. They don't have a class character together. That takes very long time to develop. And in fact, I would argue that bourgeois culture is still not very well formed in Southern Asian countries.
Right. There's also this debate on, India and the subcontinent, the system that prevailed before we got this sort of colonial capitalism, and as you described, it hasn't, even like bourgeois culture and as a class, it hasn't quite developed, and you see an uneven development of sorts as well. So in India, you have a very affluent capitalist class. In Pakistan, you have the Videra system also, it's more uh, product, there.
Wait a minute, I'm losing you here and there. Your audio is cutting out. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. But it was going in and out. So yeah.
If what I am asking is debates about the dominant mode of production that was present in the subcontinent before the British came, and there are debates as to what exactly it was in Marxist scholarship as well. You have the Asiatic mode of production as Marx sometimes termed it, and so if you can expand upon that a little bit, okay, what sorts of what the class character we had here, the class struggles and dynamics we had going on here, and how capitalism then comes in and how those social relations sort of change.
Yeah, I mean, look, just to pick up and carry forward the point I was talking about earlier, that um, you have the colonial companies initially coming, like the English East India Company. Remember, the first time they take territory in South Asia, 1757, in Bengal, when the English East India Company takes Bengal, and then they take Sindh in 1849. So almost 100 years later, and then the Sikh kingdoms, Kingdom of Lahore and so on. It takes even longer to subdue those parts of the territory. The British never subdue Afghanistan. They continue to fight in Afghanistan. Well, in a way, you can say till now. They're never really able to subdue the Afghans. But this struggle that the British fight to establish control over the whole subcontinent, I mean, in a way, it's pretty interesting how long it takes them, with their superior firepower. But of course, in the middle of this, they are making deals, because that's how they actually take power over the territory. They are making deals with either former royal families, who continue to collaborate with the English East India Company. I mean, it's often asked, why is it that the Mughal Empire allowed the English East India Company to prevail? Yeah. Well, the first thing is they didn't think the English East India Company was significant. These old land empires, for them, land was the crucial thing. The Mughals had a navy based in Gujarat and so on, but the naval fleet was not important to them. They were not a naval empire. They didn't see their navy as of significance, unlike the British, who understood early as a tiny island that their navy was, of significance, and they needed to build up naval power. That's why Britain, tiny little country, has this enormous naval presence. The Mughals looked at the water and said, "It's not for us. We command land. Why do we need the water when we dominate land revenue?" So long distance naval trade or maritime trade was not something interesting. When the British take Bengal, in fact, the Mughals say, you can have the Diwani of Bengal, you can have the right to land revenue, just have to pay us a cut. Just like, Sirajuddaula before him, before the British, Warren Hastings was like another Sirajuddaula. They didn't see him as, the white man has arrived and he is going to conquer Delhi in 1857. They didn't see that. They just thought, what's the difference between Sirajuddaula and Warren Hastings? He's just another Nawab, and the Nawabs are going to pay us the land revenue. So what do we care? That was their attitude to the English. So English cut deals very cleverly as merchants. That's how they come in. But very, very quickly, because they are developing rapid forms of production, right? Factory production in England, taking the wealth from places like Bengal, they are developing factory production. They can easily wipe out the Dhaka textile manufacturers. And that's what they start to do. So in fact, on the one side, it was the sword that was conquering South Asia, but the other side, it was the factory form, that there is no way some Nawab sitting in Awadh, was going to be constructing a factory, a karkhana, that was going to be able to compete with the factories of Manchester. In the great film Satranj Ki Khilari, made by Satyajit Ray, based on a short story, terrific short story, the Nawabs are playing chess, while the British are conquering Awadh. Well, in a way, that's a factual story. It tells it as it is, because the Nawabs had not been brought into the capitalist mode of production. They were in an older mode of production, where they basically, they collect land revenue. They collect the rent from the land. They have land armies. They defend themselves. But by the time the British arrive with factory production, blowing into their sails, They go right up the Gangetic Plain, take Sindh, and then by then, Bahadur Shah Zafar sitting in Delhi is cornered, even though there's an uprising to restore the rule of the previous kingdoms. The uprising is of no consequence because by then but what brings the British to power over the subcontinent is, in a sense, the capitalist mode of production. It's not just the Gatling gun or the sword, it's the capitalist mode of production that prevails. Marx writes in 1848, the year before Napier takes Sindh. It's interesting when you put these two storylines together. Napier is getting ready to attack Sindh in 1848. There's a massive rebellion across Europe. Marx has written the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels. And in the Communist Manifesto, they write that on pain of extinction, the capitalist mode of production is imposed on you on pain of extinction. In fact, it's a beautiful phrase because that's exactly what happens to these old kingdoms in South Asia on pain of extinction. But again, to repeat what I said earlier, South Asia is drawn into the capitalist mode of production on the terms of the English, which is that they were not going to create the factory mode of production, the factory form of production in the Gangetic Plain, up in Punjab, and so on. These places were producers of raw materials. Now, interesting, over the course of the 19th century, the factory form does come to Bombay, for instance, Karachi. They have textile industries. Why? Well, that's very interesting. And I want to tell you that story so people don't get, misunderstood about this. In 1861, there is a civil war in the United States between the North and the South. The two sides are fighting a major civil war. It goes on from 1861 to 1865, 4 crucial years. 4 years of the absolute disruption of the cotton supply from the American South. That cotton that was supplying the textile mills of Britain vanished from the world market because there were huge disruptions. 4 years of cotton disappearing from the market, raw cotton, high quality cotton, is a catastrophe. So the British were looking for suppliers for good quality cotton from around the world. One was Egypt. Egypt didn't have enough to supply the British, so they then decided to have cotton grown in the highlands of Kenya and other parts of East Africa, but basically in Kenya. So all this cotton now gets produced by farmers in Kenya, bits of Uganda. Okay, 1865 civil war ends. Now, what do you tell these cotton farmers in Kenya and Uganda? You didn't want them to stop growing cotton. You wanted a surplus cotton, but what do when there's a surplus cotton as far as the Commonwealth or the British imperial system was concerned? Well, you allowed Indian traders in East Africa to buy the cotton, take it back to India, and set up cotton factories in the west coast of India to supply the Indian market. This is the Bajajes and so on. They set up cotton factories in the west coast of India. Now, they are producing cotton, I'm going to get to this in a minute, as a kind of, a release valve for the global textile industry. That's what they were allowed to do. By the way, they become the basis, a generation later, Jamnalal Bajaj, a big funder of Mahatma Gandhi, they become the basis, the capitalists who support the Indian National Congress, because in the Swadeshi movement, they had a net benefit because they were saying, buy Indian cotton, don't buy cotton from Leicester and Manchester and Birmingham and so on. Buy cotton from Gujarat and from Maharashtra and so on. So they become funders of the Indian National Congress. So these manufacturing enclaves do develop in South Asia, but you don't really have the dynamism of the capitalist system in a full-blown fashion, because most of the wealth is being drained out of the region and taken to England and other parts of the empire. So capitalism is not in its most dynamic form in South Asia through the colonial period, except in these enclaves where you see manufacturing, such as textiles and a little bit in iron and steel. Even that has a value to the imperial war economy. So they allow the Tatars to develop an iron and steel concern in Jamshedpur and so on. But these are enclaves inside a broader drained economy, drained of wealth, drained to England and the core and so on.
Right. So while all this is going on, we're undergoing colonization, we're undergoing, changes in the mode of. What are some examples? And this is important because in, Pakistan, in the Pakistani curriculum, we don't really find much debate or discussion about the anti-colonial struggle. I mean, do in Pakistan studies, I studied O levels. So in our syllabus, we had, Indian National Congress and other stuff that was going on. But especially in the general, mythos that the Pakistani state has created, or in the context of Pakistan and Pakistani nationalism, this is not really a debate about how we fought the Britishers. What are some examples of that struggle? Bhagat Singh and his comrades, we don't really learn about him, we don't really own him, and these are figures that are shared symbols of resistance to colonialism and the barbarity of it. What are some notable examples that you would like to talk about uh, in how movements, or generally how students and workers, peasants, all of these groups, and especially the subcontinent and the undivided India is, and still the regions in Pakistan and India are very ethnically and nationally diverse, which remains a point of contention as well, both in India and Pakistan. So how did, and the religious diversity is present as well. How did they sort of bridged these divides, so-called, and gaps, and come together, and some examples of resistance to that, if you can talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, look, firstly, rebellion is at the heart of the whole colonial experience. From when the English East India Company first arrived, there are documented rebellions. I don't have any much time. I'd spend like an hour going just from one rebellion to the next. Yeah, some of these rebellions are backward looking, such as parts of the 1857 uprising, wanted to restore Bahadur Shah Zafar to his glory, or to restore the Rani of Jhansi to her glory, and make sure her son um, was the next Rana, of Jhansi, and so on. I mean, these are movements to restore the old regime. But by the 19th century, there are a series of important peasant rebellions that are really very significant, and I think, again, one needs to hesitate before talking about religious divides, because in these peasant rebellions, peasantries around southern Asia were pretty divided by region and language and so on. You don't have a cosmopolitan peasantry in the 19th century. They were rooted on the land, rooted in their areas and so on. But you don't see much violence in these peasant rebellions that cuts across religious or sectarian divides. You just don't see it. You see mass rebellions of the peasantry, which include people of different backgrounds. For instance, you have in some parts of the eastern part of the subcontinent, today's Bangladesh and West Bengal, these rebellions that take place, they unite people of all kinds of communities, because they are generalized rebellions, against British rule, or against, landlordism or whatever, right through. In fact, what's really interesting, and I want to focus on these, we talk a lot about the about the movement that leads eventually to partition. In other words, the tensions, let's say from the 1930s, that developed between the Muslim League and the All India Congress and so on. We emphasize all of that. But in 1946, at the threshold of partition, there were a series of important mass rebellions that broke across these lines. These were not elite negotiations. In Bengal, you had the Tebhaga movement, which was a movement that brought together a people of peasants of different communities. Now, there was a so-called communal angle to this. Landlords were a certain background, most of the peasantry a different background, and so on. But amongst the peasantry, there was no sense that this was a communal rebellion. It was sometimes framed by elites in a communal form, but they didn't see it like that. That's not how they rebelled. They talked about fair distribution of the produce into three bhags, into three parts, and so on. That's why it's the Tebhaga movement. That's how they understood it. In Bengal, in Bombay, you had the so-called naval mutiny, the Royal Indian Navy mutiny, or Royal Imperial Navy mutiny. Now, the Rin mutiny was completely without any sense of religious divide. The people who had come back from the Subhash Chandra Bose army, from the Azad Hind force, when they went up for trial, there was one Sikh, one Muslim, one Hindu. That's how they wanted to stand arm in arm. The three men who were tried at Purana Killa in Delhi in 1946 in the Azad Hind trial. I mean, there were these rebellions across the country. In Lahore, for instance, there were workers who came together to try to say, we don't want the kind of violence that they could see was coming, in the months ahead. In fact, it's really interesting. We don't often focus on the fact that you had these trade union movements and so on that completely opposed the division of people. Division of land and so on, that was an elite issue. That was also an imperial issue. But division of people was unacceptable. And the unions fought against that. The peasant movements fought against that for uniting the people. Whatever happens administratively, that was not something they could control. They didn't have control over that. But certainly, unification of the people, trying to hold the people together, was very interesting and important as a development. And I wish there was more study on that. You mentioned the name of Bhagat Singh. Such an interesting, person of Punjab, and not the only one. In that period after World War One, after the Great War, when soldiers came back to Punjab, Punjab was an enormous recruiting ground and remains so of the military. But as soldiers came back, we often don't recognize that they were not the only ones to return to Punjab in the aftermath of the war in 1917, 18, and 19. They were not the only ones. Also coming back to Punjab were the Gadarites. These are Punjabis who had gone into exile in an earlier period or had been recruited outside India, in China, in Hong Kong, in Japan, in the United States, in the west coast of the United States in particular, where the Gadar Party had been formed in 1913 in Stockton, California, mostly by Punjabis. These were people who would later be inspired by the October Revolution of 1917. Many of them went from California. I interviewed several of the descendants and also a sister of one of the men who went to Moscow after 1917. They were trained in the Soviet Union, and these so-called Gadar Babas came back and tried a rebellion, failed rebellion in 1915, but they came back to Punjab. They attempted to organize the peasantry against the British Empire. The British cracked down. They killed thousands of people. This turned the peasantry against the military for a generation. And it's in that period that you have people like Bhagat Singh, Rajguru, Sukhdev, Chandrasekhar Azad, and others, they were raised in the period amidst the returning soldiers who were badly treated when they returned, the Gadar Babas who were present all over the place, the emergent Kirti Kisan movement in Punjab at this period. All of that was happening to inspire young people like Bhagat Singh, to inspire people like Sukhdev, Rajguru, a whole generation, number of women enormously inspired by them, and they therefore create the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, attempt to build study groups and so on. In 1919, during the agitation against the roller tax, which was the government of India laws against anarchists and radicals during the war, the imperial government wanted to retain these laws. They were known as the roller tax. In the protests against the roller tax, Lala Lajpat Rai, enormously beloved Punjabi nationalist, was beaten and he died as a result of his wounds in the Satyagraha. By the way, Lahore was aflame in this period. Near Anarkali Bazaar, there was a huge rally where most of the workers went out on strike and so on. For days, there was agitation against the roller tax. Just down the street in Amritsar, people gathered at Jallianwala Bagh, a garden next to the Golden Temple, where General Dyer brought machine guns and killed hundreds of innocent people. Then in Gurdaspur, they flew Royal Air Force jets above peaceful gatherings of people and bombed them and fired at a school and killed students and so on from the air. This is aerial bombardment. It's not much remembered because Jallianwala Bagh was so gruesome, one has forgotten what happened in Gurdaspur. Anyway, these things inspired people like Bhagat Singh and others to take revenge, and they wanted to kill the guy, assassinate the guy who was responsible for the death of Lala Lajpat Rai. They ended up killing the wrong guy. But anyway, Bhagat Singh was hung in 1931 on the 23rd of March. Very young, he was in his 20s. But before he died, Bhagat Singh in jail studied Marxism, became a Marxist, wrote his prison diaries are beautiful. He writes in them with great feeling about fighting against the rise of religious fundamentalism. He writes about the use of mass struggles. He says to build mass movements, nonviolence indispensable, and so on. The importance of political education, of organizing the peasantry, organizing workers, not just being a small group of student radicals and so on, but going amongst the people. Beautiful histories. I want people on all sides of the border to know this history of radicalism. Well, I'm talking about Punjab, but of the subcontinent. I really wish more people knew these stories. I'm sorry to hear that these are not stories taught in school, but they should be taught by the student movement. You need to teach each other these stories about the Gadar Babas, for instance. What an incredible group of people. They go off to California, running away from British colonialism, and then they return as radicals. I mean, what an interesting group of people.
Yeah. So fast forwarding a little bit, quite a bit, we come to many people have different perspectives on it, even in the left, you know. But the partition, which I would consider a tragedy. How it's the biggest migration in history, and very brutal. Faiz Saab calls it, Faiz Saab says, "ये दाग दाग उजाला, ये शब गजीदा सहर, वो इंतजार था जिसका, ये वो सहर तो नहीं." That this is not what we, this is not the struggle that we fought for. Uh, so about the partition, the destruction, the sort of the destruction it brings about in Punjab, in Bengal, in other areas, and what it really signified for the movement you had going on and such.
Yeah, I mean, look, firstly, partition has already happened. So it's impossible to legislate whether it was a good or bad thing. It already happened. It happened 20 years before I was born, many, many years before you were born. 13 million people had to move. Um, this is how the British leave their empires. This is what they did to Palestine. They created a partition plan. The only difference between India, Pakistan, Israel, and Palestine is the Israelis violated the British partition plan and wanted to take everything. In between India and Pakistan, despite the fact that there was a 1948 military engagement, there was no real attempt to take each other. It was not on the cards. That was not the issue. There was a kind of recognition that this was a reality. But this is how the British leave countries. W.H. Auden, like Faz, wrote a very moving poem from the side of British radicalism about Radcliffe and the terrible deed that they had done. I mean, look at what the British did to the Pashtun lands. The Durand line. I mean, it's insane, but it's a reality now. Yeah, even though it's not a recognized border, in my opinion, these things should just be settled. Between Nepal and Tibet, the mess the British made when young husband goes to Lhasa and so on. I mean, the whole thing is a mess. Yeah, British colonialism and cartography, map making is a whole other business. Look at the continent of Africa, what the colonials did there. Drawing with crayon on top of people's destiny. That's what they did. My family had to leave Lahore in 1940, late 47. They had been Lahoris for several generations. Many of them were from Kartarpur Sahib. Also had to cross over. I mean, these things are heartbreaking, and vice versa. Large numbers of people leaving Bombay, leaving the what was then the United Provinces, trekking. 1 million people dead, ghastly. But it's what it is. It's where it is now. The issue isn't just partition. It's that we need to leave that behind us in a way. We need to look forward. It breaks my heart that all these years later, we don't have a delimited border between India and Pakistan. We don't have a proper understanding between each other. Therefore, we can't have, just normal relations between two countries that, have such a long and beautiful history together. It breaks my heart. When Imran Khan, as Prime Minister of Pakistan, decided to open the Kartarpur corridor, that meant a lot. Because as I've said, my great grandfather was the Guru Sahib of Kartarpur. It meant a lot for us that you could go and visit Kartarpur Sahib and so on, and vice versa. I'd like to see much more openings for Pakistanis to come to India. I don't see why we should look to each other with suspicion. You're not suspicious about people who are your former colonizers. They can just stroll into the country, but your brothers and sisters you are suspicious of. It's a crazy, crazy situation, to tell you the very honest truth. I mean, between India and Pakistan today, there really shouldn't be any outstanding issues. We are not going to solve the grave situation of Kashmir. That is not going to be solved alongside a settlement of the border. That's rather a separate issue. The border should be delimited, trade should start up, the country should help each other develop, families should be allowed to walk across the border with day passes or whatever. There should be more tourism. I mean, we need to get to know each other better. I'm so happy, on that I've been listening to these songs. I don't know anything about Umair Bhatt, but I must say, two of his songs impressed me. Both the song Blockbuster and then the recent song Titli. Why? Because in the song, the geography completely disregards the border. He's singing, saying, you look like a girl. You from Lahore? Where are you from? He's singing to the young woman who is doing the duet with him, and she says, I have a Lahore face, but I'm from Jalandhar. The geography is irrelevant. Or in Blockbuster, they say we're going to Ludhiana to get cotton cloth, to get the kurtas and so on. I mean, that that makes me feel very, very moved, to see this kind of just flagrant disregard for a ridiculous border. The border needs to be a settled entity. If France and Germany, after all the centuries of war, can have an open border inside the EU, I don't see why India and Pakistan cannot. I mean, the Nazis conquered France. They brutalized, French people, particularly French Jews, taking them in trains to concentration camps. And yet today, somebody from Germany can just come across the border on a train. Can't do that between India and Pakistan. I find that ludicrous, absolutely ridiculous, And I don't care what any ultra nationalist is going to say about me. It doesn't bother me at all. I stand by what I'm saying. I think it's ludicrous. We have histories that are so powerful that join us. What would Bhagat Singh say to the animosity, that governs India and Pakistan now? This situation in Pahalgam, it was atrocious, needs to be investigated, but did the countries need an air war? I don't think so. I don't think this air war solved anything for anybody. It doesn't advance anything. We have to advance towards peace. Otherwise, the whole world is moving. The whole global south is moving in a direction of development. And India and Pakistan have basically zero level trade between each other. It's scandalous, really scandalous.
Yeah, and in sort of moving beyond the partition, as you said, and how we have shared histories, we have shared cultures, and there isn't a need for the kind of hostility that we have in both of the countries right now, which are really at quite at an all-time high, as far as I can remember. Uh, what are and this also pertains to the work that the International People's Assembly does, and you're also part of. Building, so generally building proletarian internationalism and bringing together movements of students and peasants and workers and women, but also in regards to India and Pakistan, if you can talk about some instances of post-partition, of post-partition sort of alliances or examples of solidarity or how it can be built. Then, in regards to the sort of Jingoism, if you can talk about it and how it has taken over all mainstream narratives in the countries.
Yeah, I mean, look, let's be quite frank. Whatever cross-border solidarities you've had are limited. Small numbers of people, some small peace forums, and so on. Very limited. I mean, it's embarrassingly limited. Okay. I mean, during this air war that India and Pakistan had. By the way, trade collapsed. Whatever hundreds of millions of dollars of trade India and Pakistan do with each other, trade collapsed by 87% because of the border closure. 87%. Even that, in the scheme of things, hundreds of millions of US dollars of trade a year is nothing. Okay. Between two giant economies that sit side by side with the enormous land border that would be easy to have goods go back and forth. Okay. It's crazy. Yeah. But even during that period, I mean, when Temur Rahman and I did a live together, yeah, I got so many messages from people saying, I'm so glad you did that live. And I thought, why are you glad I did that live? Because how is this something that should be unique? There should have been hundreds of these kind of conversations. What's unique about it? That an Indian and a Pakistani are talking to each other and saying, listen, we have a history of fellowship. There should have been television channels on both sides of the border should have hosted conversations like this, but nothing. nothing like it. That's why people wrote, because they were like, this is so unique. And we got a lot of attention for just two guys hosted on People's Dispatch. For God's sake, how is this even significant? Yeah, it's not even like Al Jazeera or something which has all that money and exposure. Yeah, small website, two crazy fellows. Yeah, but people were like, what two people are talking at this moment? Why not? What is stopping us from this? Well, it's actually that our history is quite terrible. If you look back at it over the course of these 7 decades or so, there have been very limited experiences, small groups of well-meaning people crossing the border at each side, poets coming one way or the other, whether it's Javed Akhtar going to Lahore, or it's, Famida Riaz coming to Delhi, these small little things, musicians, the phenomena of Nusrat in India, these small gestures of fellowship exist, but nothing more than that, nothing more than that. And I don't even know what that more than that would be, but I do know one thing I can say is anytime there's an opening, yeah, during the Musharraf, what was it, Musharraf Manmohan Singh opening, yeah, or even before that, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, when the buses were opened, people wanted to go and see and meet each other. It's not like there isn't an appetite for it. Yeah. Look, in middle class households in India, in the last decade, not, I don't know now, but in the last decade, people just loved watching Pakistani soap operas. Yeah. In the same way as people in Pakistan enjoy watching Hindi films. I mean, these things are just a phenomena. People have in their hearts, I think, some measure of common understanding, but this is not, lifted to the level of politics, and that's really unfortunate. Um, I would have hoped that Mr. Narendra Modi, from a position of strength, being a right-wing, Hindu right-wing politician, who has had his air war with Pakistan and so on, and a sort of relatively, nondescript government in Pakistan, that they could start a dialogue now and open a channel and say, look, let's have a discussion and start having, not confidence building measures, but let's start increasing trade. Let's start having a, daily flight, Delhi Lahore or Delhi Islamabad, something like that. Let's, open, let's basically ease up things for fisher people from both sides of the border. Let's stop, picking them up in the waters. Let's just start, improving basic relations. Let's acknowledge that in the Sindh, Gujarat, and Punjab region, the border that we have is a border. It's not a line of control. It's just a border. Let's accept the border. Let's accept that in Jammu and Kashmir and Azad Kashmir, whatever that region, that we can still have an open file on how we're going to delimit that. But let's start talking, and let's also demilitarize the Siachen Peninsula. I mean, there are lots of things that they could say which would lift some of this popular sentiment into politics. But instead, for the elites on both sides of the border, the football of animosity is very convenient. Anytime you need to deal with the election or something, you just ramp up anti-India or anti-Pakistan sentiments. Very cynical use of the emotions of people. But I think there's popular sentiment which could be raised to politics, which is, listen, there's trade to be had, there's people to meet, there's culture to share, and so on. And by the way, can we just go back and start talking again of the pipeline from the South Fars field in Iran to bring natural gas to India? Can we open that up again so that India doesn't have to import liquefied natural gas from the Gulf? I mean, for God's sake, the so-called peace pipeline, a victim of of the 2000s, the war on terror, can we bring that back? Why not? It'll improve everybody's lives.
Very, very well put, comrade. About so you talk of this animosity that is very convenient, and a sort of card you pull out in both of the countries, whenever anything really happens or you want to win an election and such. As Marxists, we understand that the wars of the bourgeois, the wars of the elites, and between these nation states are not wars of the people, and especially in the context of India and Pakistan. In this, with the recent India-Pakistan fiasco that we had, we also saw, some of the left parties, which was very disappointing, both from India and Pakistan. Many notable figures in the Pakistani left were also, cheering on these war efforts and, going along with the sort of narrative that had been built in both of the countries. I would like for you to talk about that. And then, I saw on your Twitter you had reposted the IPA statement, and that was, very, very nice to read.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to criticize anybody or apologize for anybody. People take the positions they take. I can give you my views. My view is that jingoism is always bad. Yeah, it's always bad. I mean, people go to war, the poor die. That's what happens. Yeah, the poor die. And in India, the government called it Operation Sindoor. The Sindoor is, what Hindu women put in between their parting in their hair, when they get married. Well, when you get widowed, you have to wash the sindoor off. So, it's cruel to call it Operation Sindoor because lots of people had to wash their sindoor off. It's not a comforting thing to go to war like that. I mean, I just don't see the value. What if you're a game theorist, yeah, if you were to take the situation after the Pahalgam attack, which brutally killed people on holiday, not exactly anything anybody should support, yeah. And in fact, the Pakistani establishment condemned it as much as they you'd expect. They condemned it. Pakistani high officials said, look, we don't like what we saw there, yeah. Let's investigate it. We'll help you investigate it and so on. Okay, fine. The day after that, if you game theoried this out, what was the value of an air war? Who would benefit from it? Nobody. I mean, nobody would benefit. You could tell that even if both sides had been able to hold their own against the other, what's the end point? You're going to escalate to the point of a nuclear exchange because, after all, both countries have a nuclear shield. Pakistan has a nuclear shield. You attack Pakistan, if it looks like there's an existential threat, Pakistan might threaten to use a nuclear weapon. There is no end game in a war between India and Pakistan. This idea of a war circa 1965, is over. You can't have that kind of war. 1971 was a different kind of war. It was, in a way, India and Pakistan entered a war, but in fact, it's a war, around something else, which is the question of Bangladesh or, East Pakistan. It was not exactly a India-Pakistan war. The last real war between India and Pakistan, 1965, a real land war, even in 98 in Kargil, that was a strange war because nobody was sure what was going on. What's the end game? What do you think is going to happen? Who was trying to? That seemed more a war within the Pakistani establishment to destabilize the establishment rather than actually to confront it. What did you expect? You take a hillock and then you're going to have Kashmir collapse? I mean, the end game in all this for rational people must be considered and thought through. And I would say right now it is appalling, for these countries, India and Pakistan, to go to war. In fact, the situation in Kashmir is appalling. The Indian government owes the people of Kashmir explanation for why the government has been dissolved. even liberals like Ramachandra Guha, he wrote an excellent piece in the Telegraph newspaper in Calcutta, basically saying that the Indian government has betrayed the people of Kashmir on liberal grounds. Forget everything else, by annulling their government and so on. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that it doesn't interest me what other people were saying. I think they need to reflect now, having been through this stalemate of an air war, where there was no real victory for nobody. You could I can spin a victory out of defeat. Okay, most likely India is going to lose to England in the 5th test. Okay, I can spin a victory out of defeat by saying, well, the India had to play without Bumrah and blah, blah. I mean, we can say whatever you want. You can always describe it. This was not a victory for anybody. Nobody won this conflict, and nobody can win it. And if you have a possibility of withdrawing from a conflict because the conflict is not winnable, that is advisable. So I would advise all people on the left to start talking much more about the need to withdraw from conflict, to come to an understanding, to create modalities for normalization between India and Pakistan, because that is the only way forward. These countries have to normalize. There is no alternative. There is no other road. It is the only road. There are no two roads. One is war and one is peace. There is only the road of peace. There is no road of war because it's a stalemate or it's annihilation, and that's unacceptable. It is totally unacceptable. So both countries have to start on a road to peace, and the left has to commit itself to that fully. There should be no space for national aggression. One shouldn't have to duck behind the idea of popular mood and so on. At the time, a lot of people said to me, oh, you're going against the people's mood in India. How do you know what the people's mood is in India? You are just taking the media's mood and saying that's the people's mood. I don't accept that the largely right-wing media in India represents the people. I think it's separate from the people. I don't think the people's mood, I don't think the bulk of the Indian population was thinking about the calculations of this war. They had other things on their mind. For instance, hunger, starvation, lack of development, other things.
Beautifully put, comrade. I don't see any questions in the chat, so we're gonna be moving to the conclusion. I will ask you about the book you're working on right now. I think the first draft is done. Hindustan Bhi Mera Hai. If you want to talk a little bit about that, I would greatly appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, look, the book is, firstly, it's a Habib Jalib line. Hindustan bhi mera hai, Pakistan bhi mera hai, and so on. It's a great poem. I chose the first part, not to be, because, I can't really be walking around saying Pakistan bhi mera hai, but that's obviously the implication. But the subtitle is My Discovery of India, which is a play on Nehru's book from 1946, Discovery of India. And the argument of the book is the need to return to a culture of civility in the subcontinent that actually reflects our real histories. That's the argument in the book. It's about a culture of civility and a culture of reason, the need to inhabit those. But the way to tell the story, the method, was I tell the story of my family, which is, for me, a very difficult thing to do. Generally, Marxists don't talk about themselves, and they don't like to talk about their families and so on. But I was pretty happy, actually, to tell you the honest truth, because I'm pretty proud of my forebearers. I'm proud of the lives they led. They were not radicals in the classical sense. They didn't go to jail with Bhagat Singh and Sukhdev and Rajguru, but they did their own things. My grandfather, my father's father, was the child of the Guru Sahib of Kartarpur. He decided to become a scientist, left the Gurdwara behind, and spent his life as an institution builder in late colonial India and then in the Indian Republic. he built the fisheries, institute and so. But at the same time, this fellow translated, from Farsi and Arabic and Turkic languages. He translated Humayun's writings. He worked with Hidayat Hussain to translate Dara Shikoh's text, on the two oceans. It's actually a beautiful text. He didn't help that translation, but he very much used that text, which is Dara Shikoh's book from the 16th century about what he calls the two oceans, the Bahrains. What are the two oceans? Sufi thought and Hindu mysticism. And Dara Shikoh was greatly interested in the melding of these traditions in the 16th century. He was the son of Shah Jahan, the builder of the Taj Mahal and so on. These were tremendous people, in the 19th century and 20th century. They took an interest in the complexities of our histories, their complexities, the complexities of our histories. They took seriously, people like Akbar, who said, well, I'm here now, and outside my window are these people. They have a different faith, but I want to learn about them. So, by the way, Dara Shikoh also translates the Upanishads, into Farsi from Sanskrit. He learned Sanskrit and translate. These were interesting people. At the same time, there are these pundits who, were translating the Quran into Hindustani at the time. I mean, these are people I admire, and my grandfather is in that tradition because he translated their books. And he was very interested in the complexities of our culture and history, and that's exactly what I'm trying to do in this book is to retranslate those lives from that side of a kind of cultural divide. People who took friendship seriously, who took scholarship seriously, who took reason seriously. And in taking reason seriously, they really disliked the supremacy, that was around them. The great revulsion they felt for Hindu supremacy, for instance. It sort of helped that my grandfather was very much a scientist, but he took that form of supremacy for him was repulsive, And I grew up in a household with parents who greatly despised things like the caste system and supremacy, all kinds of supremacy, filled with contradictions, by the way, filled with contradictions. And I love that. And I want to, kind of, as I say, translate that into a slim book. And I'm really happy that it's going to be illustrated by Comrade Fatima. I'm going to have some pictures in it from my own family album and so on. My parents took some photographs at Sindri in 1950 something, when 56, I think, Nehru gives a speech where he says that factories are the temples of India, of modern India, that kind of thing. There's also a photograph I took when Morarji Desai wins the election in 1977, and my mother, a group of people at Morarji Desai all together, and I took that picture. And I have a funny story I tell about going to Morarji Desai's house that day. My parents went to congratulate him for defeating the Congress. But I tell a funny story. I won't tell you the story now, but it'll be in the book. Yeah, it's a funny story. It has to do with, no, I won't tell you. Yeah.
It's okay. It's okay. We will read it in the book. When can we expect the book?
Hopefully sometime this year. Hopefully. Yeah.
Amazing. So it was very good having this discussion with you, Comrade, especially having read your works and, watched your speeches for so long. Let me check if we have any questions. Okay. No questions. So yeah,
okay, perfect.
We're concluding the session now. Thank you for.
Okay.
Thank you for.
Bye. Take care of yourself.
Lazim.
Bye. Bye.